In the exclusive estates of Greenwich, Connecticut, the wounded marketing executive was about to face his greatest professional challenge. What started as an elegant garden party took a shocking turn when three former allies came face to face with the lies that had destroyed their relationships. William Moire wasn't your typical heartbroken ex-boyfriend. For 3 years, he had spent his life perfecting the art of image management, known for turning personal disasters into public victories. When he encountered Madison's carefully orchestrated celebration of new beginnings with Jessica Reynolds at his side, had no idea they were walking into a battlefield where secrets would become weapons and the truth would leave everyone bleeding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The elevator's polished bronze doors slid shut with their familiar whisper, sealing William Moire into the familiar sanctuary of his 42nd floor ascent, where her reflection stared back from the mirrored walls. Charcoal Tom Ford suit, impeccably tailored. Steel gray tie, knotted with precision, dark. Hair styled with the kind of effortless perfection that actually required considerable effort. Even after 12 hours of client presentations and strategy sessions, he looked every inch the successful marketing executive he'd worked so relentlessly to become. But beneath the polished exterior, exhaustion pulled at the corners of his eyes. The Hartwell Industries campaign had demanded everything from him. To day 3 revised proposals, to client meetings and a conference call that had stretched well past 7. At 32, William had climbed from his middle-class roots in Manchester to this corner office view of Hartford's skyline. And the climb had taught him that image was everything. Success was a performance, and he'd perfected every gesture. Every inflection, every calculated smile. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the 45th floor. His Hartford apartment was exactly what someone of his stature should own. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Connecticut River, Italian leather furniture arranged with architectural precision, abstract art chosen more for its investment. Potential than aesthetic appeal. It was a showplace, really. It's a kind of space designed to impress, rather than comfort. William loosened his tie as he walked through the foyer, his footsteps muffled by the Persian rug that had cost more than most people's monthly salary. The day's mail sat in a neat stack on the marble console table, sorted by his building's concierge service. Bills, professional correspondence. A few invitations to industry events, the usual detritus of a successful life lived in the public eye, but the cream-colored envelope on top made his breath catch. The paper was expensive, heavy stock with a subtle texture that spoke of old money and careful breeding. His name was written across the front in Madison's distinctive calligraphy. Each letter formed with the kind of artistic precision she'd learned at her elite prep school. William Moire flowed across the envelope in midnight blue ink, the same shade she'd used for their Christmas cards last year. Before everything had gone to hell. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, though he told himself it was simply fatigue from the long day. Inside, the invitation was even more elaborate than the envelope suggested. Embossed lettering announced a celebration of new beginnings to be held at the Collins family estate in Greenwich. The date was 2 weeks away, a Saturday evening. In late July, below the formal text, Madison had added a handwritten note in her flowing script. Time to turn the page on old chapters and embrace what's next. Your presence would make the evening complete. The words hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just any party. This was Madison's breakup announcement. Her public declaration that their 3-year relationship was over and that she was ready to move on. She was turning their private pain into a social media event, complete with catered food, professional photography, and their entire social circle as witnesses. William sank into his leather armchair, the invitation still trembling in his grip. The memory of their last conversation crashed over him with brutal clarity. They'd been sitting in her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park space. That had always made him feel slightly inadequate, despite his own success. The morning light had filtered through her floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in the golden glow that made Madison look like something from a fashion magazine. "I can't do this anymore, William," she'd said, her voice steady but her hand shaking as she set down her coffee cup. I feel like I'm dating a brand instead of a person. You're so concerned with how everything looks, how everything appears to other people, that I don't think you even know who you really are anymore." He tried to argue, tried to explain that his attention to image was about building their future together, about creating the kind of life they both deserved. But Madison had shaken her head, her blonde hair catching the light like spun gold. "I used to think you were passionate about your work, about us, about life. But passion requires vulnerability, William. It requires being willing to look messy sometimes, to be human. You've become so polished, so perfect, that there's nothing real left to hold on to." The words had felt like physical blows. He'd tried to tell her about the ring hidden in his sock drawer, about the proposal he'd been planning for their upcoming anniversary, but she'd held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Don't," she'd whispered. "Please don't make this harder than it already is. I know you think you love me, but you're more in love with the idea of us, with how we look together, with what we represent. I need someone who loves me enough to let me see them fall apart sometimes. You won't even let me see you without gel in your hair." The breakup had been swift and surgical after that. She'd kept the apartment they'd practically shared. He'd retreated to his sterile Hartford penthouse, and their social media accounts had gone conspicuously quiet about each other. For 6 weeks, William had told himself it was temporary, that Madison would realize her mistake and come back to him, that their relationship had been too good, too perfect to really be over. While staring at the invitation, he understood how naive that hope had been. His phone buzzed against the glass coffee table. Trevor's name flashed on the screen, and William answered without thinking. "Let me guess." Trevor's voice carried the warm familiarity of their 15-year friendship. "You found the invitation? You got one too?" William's voice sounded hollow to his own ears. Claire did. "She's friends with Rachel Martinez, remember? Madison's new bestie." There was a pause, and William could hear the sounds of domestic life in the background, cartoons playing on TV, Trevor's 3-year-old daughter Emma laughing at something. "Look, man, I know what you're thinking, but don't do it." "Don't do what?" "Whatever dramatic gesture you're planning." "I can hear it in your voice, that tone you get when you're about to do something spectacular and stupid. Remember the Henderson campaign? When you rented that billboard to prove a point to the client?" William almost smiled despite himself. The Henderson campaign had nearly cost him his job, but it had also won him the biggest account of his career. "This is different." "Trevor, no, it's not. This is Madison playing games, trying to control the narrative of your breakup. She wants everyone to see her as the gracious one, the one who's moved on while you're, sitting alone in your apartment, nursing wounds? Don't give her that satisfaction." Through his windows, the Connecticut River reflected the last light of the summer evening, its surface broken by the wake of a lone sailboat. William had always loved this view, the way it made him feel above the fray of ordinary life. But tonight, it felt isolating rather than elevating. "She's going to tell everyone her version of what happened," William said quietly. "That I was emotionally unavailable, that I cared more about appearances than our relationship. To make me look like some kind of narcissistic automaton, showing up at her party is going to change that how." William stood, pacing to the window. 45 floors below, Hartford's evening traffic moved in orderly streams. Everyone heading home to their real lives, their authentic relationships, their genuine connections. "I don't know yet, but I can't let her win this, Trevor. I can't let her have the last word." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that William wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Trevor spoke, his voice heavy. With the weight of their long friendship, "Will, I love you like a brother, but sometimes I think Madison might have had a point. When's the last time you did something just because it felt right, not because it looked right?" The question hung between them like an accusation. William wanted to argue, to list all the spontaneous, authentic moments he and Madison had shared. But as he searched his memory, every example that came to mind had been carefully orchestrated, perfectly staged for their social media presence or their friends' approval. "I have to go," William said abruptly. Will, wait, but William had already ended the call. He stood at his window, the invitation still clutched in his hand, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Trevor was wrong. This wasn't about dramatic gestures or spectacular revenge. This was about truth, making sure that when Madison told their story to their friends, there was someone there to provide context, to show that their relationship had been more complex than her simple narrative of emotional unavailability. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts, his mind already working through possibilities. If Madison wanted to turn their breakup into a public performance, then he would give her a performance she'd never forget. He would need an ally, someone who understood Madison's games and had the skills to play them better. His thumb hovered over Jessica Reynolds' contact information. They'd met at industry events, had moved in overlapping professional circles, but had never been more than cordially acquainted. What he knew about her, though, was intriguing. She was sharp, successful, and if rumors were true, had her own complicated history with Madison Collins. William smiled for the first time since finding the invitation. If Madison wanted to control the narrative, she was about to learn that every story had more than one side. And sometimes the most interesting chapters were written by the people who'd been edited out of the first draft. The next morning, William stared at Jessica Reynolds' LinkedIn profile on his laptop screen, his cursor hovering over the message, button. Outside his office window, Hartford's business district hummed with purposeful energy. But William's mind was elsewhere, carefully crafting the perfect approach. Jessica's profile was impressive. Senior VP at Meridian Communications, one of Connecticut's most prestigious PR firms. Her photograph showed an elegant woman with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to see right through the camera lens. More importantly, her employment history revealed a significant gap 2 years ago. Right around the time rumors had circulated about a major falling out with Madison, industry gossip suggested it had been brutal, involving stolen clients and damaged reputations, but the details had been kept surprisingly quiet for such a public business. William began typing, then deleted his words, then started again. How did one approach a virtual stranger with a proposition to crash your ex-girlfriend's public humiliation party? The normal rules of professional networking hardly applied. Finally, he settled on directness. Ms. Reynolds, I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing regarding a matter of mutual interest concerning Madison Collins. I believe we may have more in common than either of us initially realized. Would you be available for coffee this afternoon? Think you'll find the conversation worthwhile? Best regards, William Moire. He hit send before he could second-guess himself further. The response came faster than he'd expected, arriving just as he was settling into a client presentation about rebranding strategies for local restaurants. His phone buzzed discreetly. Mr. Moire, your timing is interesting. Caf Central, downtown Hartford, 3 p.m. I assume this is about the invitation. The fact that she'd mentioned the invitation immediately told William everything he needed to know. Jessica had received one too, and like him, she understood exactly what Madison was attempting to orchestrate. Caf Central occupied the ground floor of a converted brownstone in Hartford's Arts District. Its exposed brick walls and industrial lighting creating an atmosphere that was both sophisticated and unpretentious. William arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a corner table that offered privacy and a clear view of the entrance. He ordered a double espresso and tried to organize his thoughts. When Jessica Reynolds walked through the door at exactly 3 o'clock, William understood immediately why she'd been successful in the competitive world of public relations. She moved with the kind of confident grace that commanded attention without seeming to seek it. Her charcoal business suit impeccably tailored. Her auburn hair pulled back in a style that was both professional and elegant. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of Madison, the same polish, the same awareness of her own presence, but where Madison's confidence had always carried an edge of calculation, Jessica seemed more genuine. Mr. Moire, she said, extending her hand as she approached his table. Her handshake was firm, her green eyes direct and assessing. Thank you for the intriguing message. I have to admit you've piqued my curiosity. Please, call me William, and thank you for coming on such short notice. He stood to pull out her chair, a gesture that earned him a slight smile. A gentleman. How refreshing. She settled into her seat and signaled the waitress for coffee. Though I suspect chivalry isn't why you wanted to meet. You mentioned mutual interests regarding Madison Collins. William had prepared several different approaches for this conversation, ranging from subtle to direct. Now, looking at Jessica's intelligent, no-nonsense expression, he decided on honesty. I received an invitation to Madison's celebration of New Beginnings party, he said, watching Jessica's face carefully. I'm assuming you did as well, given your response to my message. Jessica's smile was thin, but knowing. Ah, yes, Madison's farewell tour. Quite the theatrical production, even by her standards. Though I have to say, I'm surprised she had the audacity to invite me. Then you're not planning to attend? I hadn't decided yet. The invitation was unexpected. Madison and I haven't spoken in 2 years. Jessica's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, and for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her composed features, I assume. You know about our falling out? I know there was a professional disagreement. Madison mentioned it once, but she wasn't specific about details. Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Professional disagreement, that's one way to put it. She leaned back in her chair, studying William with those penetrating green eyes. Tell me, William, what was your relationship with Madison really like? Because I have a feeling the public version and the private reality were quite different. The question hit closer to home than William had expected. He found himself remembering Trevor's words from the night before, the uncomfortable challenge, about when he'd last done something that felt right rather than looked right. We were together for 3 years, he said carefully. Madison ended things 6 weeks ago. She said I was emotionally unavailable, more concerned with appearances than with genuine connection. And were you? The directness of the question caught him off guard. I thought I was being responsible, building a future for us. Madison comes from money, her family, the society connections, the lifestyle she's used to. I worked hard to be worthy of that. Jessica nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her expression. She has a way of making you feel like you need to earn your place in her world, doesn't she? Like love is a performance that has to be perfect every time. You sound like you speak from experience. It's not romantic experience, but yes, I understand the dynamic. Jessica's voice carried a note of old pain. Madison and I were best friends. For 5 years, we met in college, bonded over our shared ambition and our mutual disdain for the trust fund babies who thought success was their birthright. We supported each other through internships, first jobs, early career struggles, thought. We were building something real. She paused, her coffee growing cold as the memory pulled her backward. 2 years ago, I was working on the biggest account of my career, Hartwell Industries' complete rebrand. Madison knew how much it meant to me, how hard I'd worked to win their trust. But when they started having second thoughts about my proposal, she went to them directly. William's chest tightened. Hartwell Industries was his current client, the account he'd been working on just yesterday. What did she do? She convinced them that I was too junior, too inexperienced for such a major project. She had her father make some calls. You know how connected the Collins family is. She presented herself as the safer choice, the one with better breeding and more sophisticated understanding of their image needs. Jessica's voice remained steady, but her knuckles had gone white around her coffee cup. She took the account and killed my proposal in the same conversation. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, but William meant them. He understood professional betrayal, understood how it felt to have someone you trusted use your vulnerabilities against you. The worst part wasn't losing the account, though that nearly ended my career. The worst part was that she genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. Madison has this incredible ability to convince herself that her self-interest aligns with some higher good. She probably told herself she was protecting Hartwell Industries from making a mistake with me. William felt something shift in his understanding, not just of Jessica, but of Madison, of their entire relationship. She never told me what really happened between you two. She just said you'd grown apart, that your career goals had become incompatible. Madison doesn't lie exactly. She just edits reality until it supports her preferred narrative. Jessica finally took a sip of her coffee, making a face at how cold it had become. Which brings us to why you really wanted to meet with me today. You're planning to attend her party, aren't you? And you want an ally? The observation was delivered without judgment, but William felt exposed nonetheless. The thought had occurred to me. What are you hoping to accomplish? It was the same question Trevor had asked, but coming from Jessica, it felt less like criticism and more like strategy. I want people to hear more than just her version of events. I want them to see that our relationship was more complicated than her narrative of emotional unavailability. Jessica considered this, her intelligent eyes studying his face. And you'd think having me there would help accomplish that? I think having someone who understands Madison's methods would be valuable. Someone who's seen behind the facade. Someone with an axe to grind, you mean? William started to protest, but Jessica held up her hand. I'm not offended. It's accurate. I do have an axe to grind. It's the question is whether grinding it publicly serves any useful purpose, or whether it just makes me look petty and vindictive. She fell silent, gaze moving to the window where Hartford's afternoon light slanted through the cafe's industrial windows. William waited, sensing that she was weighing something more complex than simple revenge. Finally, she looked back at him. If I were to attend this party, and I'm not saying I will, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we attend together, that we present a united front to people who know Madison well enough to provide context. To her celebration of new beginnings, you're proposing that we crash her party together? I'm proposing that we accept her invitation together. Jessica's smile was sharp and genuine for the first time since she'd arrived. That's an important distinction. What happens after we provide this context? What's your endgame here? William. The question forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding since finding the invitation. What did he really want from this? Public vindication, private satisfaction, some kind of closure that would let him move on. I want Madison to understand that relationships aren't just stories you get to tell however you want, he said finally. I want her to face the fact that other people's feelings and reputations matter. And I want our friends to see that there are always two sides to every breakup. Jessica nodded slowly. Those are reasonable goals. Naive, perhaps, but reasonable. Right. She signaled for the check. Give me 24 hours to think about it. If I decide to do this, I'll have conditions. The kind that make sure we're partners in this endeavor, not just convenient weapons for each other's revenge fantasies. She stood, gathering her purse. I'll be in touch, William, one way or another. As she walked toward the cafe's exit, William felt something he hadn't experienced since finding Madison's invitation. Hope. Not for reconciliation. That ship had sailed, but for the possibility that he didn't have to face Madison's theater alone. That someone else understood the gap between the public Madison and the private one, and had their own reasons for wanting that gap exposed. He finished his espresso and stared out at Hartford's bustling streets, already planning his next move. 26 hours passed before Jessica's response arrived. William had spent most of that time in a state of restless anticipation, checking his phone obsessively between client meetings and struggling to focus on the mundane details of campaign, strategies, and budget projections. When her message finally came through, it was characteristically direct. I'm in, but we need to establish ground rules. My office. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. Come prepared to discuss strategy, not just revenge. William arrived at Meridian Communications 15 minutes early, using the time to study the firm's impressive lobby with its polished marble floors and wall-mounted awards, celebrating decades of PR victories. Jessica's success was evident in every detail. From the prestigious address to the caliber of clients featured in the framed case studies lining the walls. This wasn't just professional achievement, it was a statement of power in an industry where reputation was everything. Mr. Moire, young assistant, appeared at his elbow. Ms. Reynolds will see you now. Jessica's corner office commanded a spectacular view of Hartford's skyline, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing the Connecticut River in the golden light of early evening. She stood with her back to the door when he entered, her silhouette sharp against the backdrop of the city she'd conquered despite Madison's attempts to derail her career. Punctual, I appreciate that in a potential conspirator." She turned, and William noticed she'd changed from her earlier business attire into dark jeans and a silk blouse that somehow managed to look both casual and elegant. "Would you like something to drink? I have excellent bourbon, mediocre wine, and coffee that could wake the dead." "Bourbon sounds perfect, actually." She moved to a well-stocked bar cart in the corner of her office, pouring 2 glasses of what William recognized as Pappy Van Winkle bourbon that cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent. The gesture spoke to both her success and her intention to treat this conversation seriously. "2 questionable decisions and their inevitable consequences," Jessica said, raising her glass. "2 truth-telling in all its messy forms," William countered. They drank, and William felt the bourbon's warmth spread through his chest. Loosening some of the tension he'd carried since receiving Madison's invitation, Jessica settled into the chair across from her desk, gesturing for him to take the matching seat. "I spent most of yesterday trying to talk myself out of this," she began without preamble. "My mentor, Catherine Brooks, thinks I'm making a mistake. She believes engaging with Madison in any capacity is professional suicide disguised as personal vindication. But you're here anyway." "I'm here because sometimes the professional thing and the right thing aren't the same thing." Jessica swirled the bourbon in her glass, watching the amber liquid catch the last rays of sunlight. "Because I've spent 2 years watching Madison rebuild her narrative about our friendship, positioning herself as the victim of my supposed professional jealousy. I'm tired of letting her control that story. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." William leaned forward, sensing an opening. "What did she tell people about what happened between you?" I became obsessed with competing with her. That I couldn't handle her family connections and started viewing our friendship as a business rivalry. That she had to distance herself from my toxic ambition for her own mental health. Jessica's voice remained steady, but William caught the flash of pain in her eyes. All technically true, in the way that Madison's version of events are always technically true. Just missing the part where she systematically undermined my career and stole my biggest client. How do we make sure people hear the whole story? Carefully. Madison has home field advantage. Here it's her party, her guest list, her carefully constructed narrative about moving on from toxic relationships. We can't just show up and start making accusations. That makes us look desperate and vindictive. William nodded, appreciating Jessica's strategic thinking. "Yes. So what's your approach?" "We give them a performance, but not the one Madison's expecting. She's counting on you to show up looking bitter and jealous, maybe making a scene that reinforces her narrative about your emotional immaturity. Instead, we show up looking happy, successful, and completely unbothered by her little celebration. Together. Together." But here's where it gets interesting. Jessica stood, moving to her desk where she'd laid out what looked like reconnaissance materials, printouts of social media posts, guest lists, even floor plans of the Collins estate. Madison's been posting about this party for weeks, building anticipation. She's framing it as her triumphant emergence from a relationship that was holding her back. But she's also been dropping hints about surprising revelations and truths finally coming to light. William felt his stomach tighten. What kind of truths? That's what we need to find out. Madison doesn't do anything without multiple layers of strategy. This party isn't just about celebrating your breakup. It's about something bigger. Something she thinks will definitively position her as the wronged party in your relationship. The implications hit William like a physical blow. He thought about the rings still hidden in his sock drawer, about the proposal Madison had stopped him from making, about all the private moments she could weaponize if she chose to. "You think she's planning to ambush me?" I think Madison Collins has never done anything in her life without an audience and a purpose. This party is theater, and she's written herself as both the director and the star. Jessica returned to her chair, her expression serious. The question is, are we willing to be part of her production, or do we want to write our own script? William drained his bourbon, feeling the liquid courage burn away some of his apprehension. "What did you have in mind?" "We beat her at her own game, Instead of reacting to whatever she has planned, we control the narrative from the moment we walk in. We show up looking like the power couple she wishes she could be part of, successful, confident, completely over whatever drama she's trying to create. Fake it till we make it. More like strategic authenticity. We let people see who we really are when we're not performing for Madison's approval. Jessica's smile carried a hint of mischief. You might be surprised how appealing that is. Two people who've been watching Madison's productions for years. William found himself smiling back, caught up in Jessica's confidence and the intoxicating possibility of turning Madison's trap into their triumph. You've really thought this through? I've had 2 years to think about it. Every time I see Madison at industry events, every time she posts one of her carefully curated social media updates, every time someone mentions her name in my presence, I've been planning this conversation. Jessica's voice softened. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not ashamed of it either. Sometimes revenge and justice look remarkably similar from the outside. They spent the next hour working through details, timing, wardrobe, conversational strategies. Jessica had an almost military approach to planning, considering every possible scenario and developing contingencies for Madison's likely responses. By the time they finished, William felt something he hadn't experienced since receiving the invitation: excitement. There's one more thing, Jessica said as they prepared to leave. If we're going to do this, we need to be honest with each other about our motivations. This can't work if either of us is hiding our real agenda. William considered the question, surprised by how difficult it was to answer. I want Madison to understand that she can't just erase people from her story when they become inconvenient. I want our friends to see that relationships are messy and complicated, not just the neat narratives we tell ourselves. And I want to prove to myself that I'm more than just the image-obsessed automaton she thinks I am. Jessica nodded approvingly. Honest, my turn. She took a deep breath. I want Madison to face the consequences of her actions for once in her privileged life. I want people to see the gap between her public persona and her private behavior. And I want to prove that she didn't break me when she tried. And Jessica's smile was rueful. And I want to see if the man who was brave enough to reach out to a virtual stranger for help with his relationship problems is as interesting as he seems. The admission hung between them, adding a new layer of complexity to their alliance. William felt the shift in the room's energy, the recognition that they were no longer just strategic partners, but to people who might genuinely enjoy each other's company. Well, he said finally, I guess we'll find out together. Left Meridian Communications, walking into Hartford's warm summer evening, William felt the weight of the past 6 weeks beginning to lift. Madison's party was still 2 weeks away, but for the first time since finding her invitation, he wasn't dreading it. Instead, he was looking forward to discovering what kind of story he and Jessica might write together, both at the party and beyond. The morning of Madison's party arrived with a kind of oppressive July heat that made Connecticut's wealthy retreat to their air-conditioned sanctuaries and imported European fans. William stood in his bathroom at 6 a.m., staring at his reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror, trying to recognize the man looking back at him. For the first time in months, he hadn't applied hair gel immediately after showering. His dark hair fell in soft waves across his forehead, and the effect was different, less polished, more human. Jessica's words from their planning sessions echoed in his mind: stop performing perfection and start showing people who you actually are. It had been 2 weeks of intensive preparation that felt more like intensive therapy. 3 more strategy sessions at Jessica's office, to practice dinners where they'd tested their conversational chemistry, and countless text exchanges that had evolved from tactical planning into something that felt suspiciously like flirting. William had found himself looking forward to Jessica's messages with an anticipation that had nothing to do with Madison's party and everything to do with Jessica's sharp wit and unexpected vulnerability. You're overthinking the hair, he told. His reflection then immediately applied a small amount of styling crema. Compromise between his usual armor of perfection and Jessica's call for authenticity. His phone buzzed with a text from Trevor. Last chance to reconsider this insanity. Claire made me promise to tell you that revenge plots never end well in romantic comedies. William smiled despite his nerves. Trevor had been waging a gentle campaign against the party plan for 2 weeks, alternating between direct confrontation and subtle manipulation. Yesterday's intervention had involved bringing his 3-year-old daughter Emma to William's apartment, apparently hoping that her innocent questions about why Uncle Will was sad might inspire a moment of clarity. Too late for second thoughts. William texted back, "But I appreciate the concern. At least tell me you're not planning anything spectacularly stupid." Define spectacular. Anything that would require me to bail you out of jail or social exile? William paused, considering. Their plan wasn't spectacular in the traditional sense, no dramatic confrontations or public accusations. Instead, it was subtly subversive. Present a united front, let people draw their own conclusions and allow Madison's own behavior to reveal the gaps in her narrative. Nothing jail-worthy. Promise. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. Across town, Jessica was facing her own pre-party crisis of confidence. She stood in her walk-in closet, surrounded by rejected outfit options, trying to find the perfect balance between elegance and subtle defiance. The black dress hanging on the back of her door was stunning, a sleek Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress that emphasized her figure without being obvious about it. It was the kind of dress that would make Madison's carefully chosen party outfit look overdone by comparison. But more than clothing, she was grappling with the realization that her feelings about tonight had evolved far beyond her original desire for vindication. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd discovered that William Moire was more complex and interesting than his polished public persona suggested. Behind the marketing executive's careful composure was a man who asked thoughtful questions, listened to her answers, and made her laugh with an unexpectedly dry sense of humor. Her phone rang, interrupting her wardrobe crisis. Catherine Brooks. Name appeared on the screen, and Jessica almost let it go to voicemail. Her mentor had made her disapproval of tonight's plan abundantly clear. "Good morning, Catherine. Last chance to come to your senses." Catherine's voice carried the authority of someone who'd navigated decades of PR crises. "This party is a mistake, Jessica. You're letting Madison Collins drag you down to her level. I'm finally calling her out for 2 years of lies. In front of 50 of Connecticut's most influential people, at an event specifically designed to make you look petty and vindictive." Catherine's sigh was audible through the phone. "You've built a brilliant career on being above this kind of drama. Don't throw it away for the temporary satisfaction of revenge." Jessica sank onto her bed, the black dress still in her hands. What if it's not about revenge anymore? What do you mean? What if it's about finally telling the truth? About Madison, about what really happened between us, about the kind of person she actually is when no one's watching. And William Moire. Is he part of this truth-telling mission? Or is this about something else entirely? The question hit closer to home than Jessica was comfortable admitting. William understands what it's like to be on the receiving end of Madison's narrative control. "We're allies in this." "Allies?" Katarine's tone suggested she wasn't buying the explanation. "Jessica, I've watched you navigate romantic relationships for 5 years. You've never once needed an ally before." After ending the call with Catherine's warning still ringing in her ears, Jessica made her final wardrobe decision. The black dress it was. If she was going to walk into Madison's perfectly orchestrated event, she was going to look like she belonged there, not as Madison's former friend seeking redemption, but as a successful woman who'd built her own life and didn't need anyone's approval. At 3 o'clock, William and Jessica met for their pre-party dinner at the Study, an upscale restaurant in downtown Hartford that specialized in new American cuisine and discreet corners where business deals were made and personal dramas were discussed in hushed tones. They'd chosen it specifically because it was the kind of place where their dinner might be noticed and reported back to party guests before they even arrived at the Collins estate. "You look incredible," William said as Jessica approached their table, and he meant it. The black dress was sophisticated without being flashy, and she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. "You don't look too bad yourself." Jessica's smile was warm but nervous. "Though I have to say, I like the hair. Less Gordon Gekko, more actual human being." They ordered Wien a bottle of Sancerre that was expensive enough to suggest celebration. rather than desperation, and tried to maintain normal conversation despite the weight of the evening ahead. But as the afternoon light shifted toward evening, their strategic planning gave way to something more personal. "Can I ask you something?" Jessica said, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. "What did you actually see in Madison? I mean, beyond the obvious attractions." William considered the question, surprised by how difficult it was to answer. "She made me feel like I was part of something bigger than myself. The Collins family, the social connections, the lifestyle. It felt like ascending to a level I'd only dreamed about growing up." He paused, realizing how shallow that sounded. But more than that, she had this way of making ordinary moments feel significant, like we were the stars of our own romantic comedy, even if it was all performance. I didn't know it was performance at the time. Or maybe I didn't want to know. William met Jessica's eyes across the table. "What about you? What did you see in your friendship with her?" Possibility. Madison represented everything I thought I wanted. Confidence, connections, the ability to move through the world like it was created specifically for your enjoyment. Jessica's laugh was rueful. She made me believe I could be the kind of person who belonged in rooms I'd only dreamed of entering. Now I think I prefer earning my place in those rooms on my own terms. As they prepared to leave for the Collins estate in Greenwich, William felt the familiar flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation. But for the first time in weeks, the anticipation wasn't entirely about Madison. It was about walking into that party with Jessica beside him, about showing their social circle a different version of himself, about the possibility that tonight might be the beginning of something new rather than just the ending of something old. "Ready?" Jessica asked, her hand finding his as they stood beside his car. "Ready," William said, and for the first time since receiving Madison's invitation, he genuinely meant it. The drive to Greenwich would take 45 minutes, giving them time for final preparations and last-minute doubts. But as they pulled out of Hartford and onto the highway that would take them to Madison's perfectly orchestrated celebration, both William and Jessica felt the strange calm that comes from knowing you're about to walk into a storm you've spent weeks preparing for. The real question wasn't whether they were ready for Madison's party. The question was whether Madison was ready for them. The Collins family estate sprawled across 12 manicured acres in Greenwich's most exclusive enclave. Georgian colonial architecture speaking to old money and older bloodlines. As William's BMW navigated the winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees, Jessica felt her breath catch despite herself. She'd been here before, during the golden years of her friendship with Madison. But seeing it now as an adversary rather than an ally made the property's imposing grandeur feel almost threatening. "Jesus," William murmured, his hands tightening. On the steering wheel, as the main house came into view, I forgot how massive this place is. The 3-story mansion rose before them like something from a Fitzgerald novel, its limestone facade glowing in the early evening light. Elegant Georgian windows looked out over perfectly manicured gardens, where topiary sculptures cast dramatic shadows across emerald lawns. A circular fountain dominated the front courtyard, its crystal water catching the light like scattered diamonds. But it was the cars already assembled in the circular drive that made Jessica's stomach clench with recognition. Mercedes, BMWs, a few Teslas, and one unmistakable vintage Porsche that belonged to Richard Hartwell himself, the client Madison had stolen from her 2 years ago. The guest list was a who's who of Connecticut's business and social elite. Exactly the audience Madison would want for her performance. "Second thoughts?" William asked, noticing Jessica's sudden tension. "Too late for those now." Jessica checked her reflection in the passenger mirror, touching up her lipstick with practiced precision. "Remember what we discussed? We're not here to start a fight. We're here to let Madison start one and handle it better than she expects." As they approached the main entrance, valets in crisp white shirts and black bow ties materialized to take William's keys. The young man who opened Jessica's door looked like he'd stepped out of a Ralph Lauren advertisement, his smile professionally warm but impersonal. "Good evening and welcome to the Collins estate," he said, with the kind of practiced charm that spoke to expensive training. "The celebration is being held in the East Gardens. Please follow the pathway marked with lanterns." The pathway he indicated wound around the side of the house, lit by dozens of antique-style lanterns that cast a romantic glow over the perfectly maintained grounds. As they walked, Jessica could hear the sounds of the party drifting through. The warm evening air, laughter, conversation, the gentle clink of glasses, and what sounded like a string quartet playing something classical and appropriately sophisticated. "Are you ready for this?" William asked, offering Jessica his arm as they approached the garden entrance. "As ready as anyone can be for voluntary social warfare," Jessica replied, but she took his arm gratefully. The solid warmth of his presence helped steady her nerves. They rounded the final corner and stepped into Madison's masterpiece. The East Garden had been transformed into something from a magazine spread about elegant entertaining. Round tables covered in cream-colored linens were scattered across the lawn, each centerpiece a carefully arranged collection of white roses and greenery. String lights had been woven through the trees overhead, creating a canopy of stars that would look magical once darkness fell. A temporary dance floor had been installed near the garden's center. The string quartet was positioned on a small raised platform surrounded by flowering hedges. But it was the guests that made Jessica's pulse quicken with recognition and old anxiety. Here was the entire social ecosystem that had once felt like home successful professionals. Old money families, rising stars in business and politics, people she'd known, worked with, competed against, and in some cases, genuinely cared about. And there, holding court near the bar setup, was Madison Collins in all her orchestrated glory. She wore a flowing white dress that managed to suggest both innocence and sophistication, her blonde hair styled in loose waves that caught the light perfectly. She was surrounded by a small group of admirers, her hands gesturing expressively as she told what was undoubtedly a carefully crafted story about her journey of self-discovery since ending her relationship with William. The moment Madison spotted them, Jessica watched her face cycle through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally, a smile that was so perfectly calibrated it could have been created by algorithm. "William." Madison's voice carried across the garden with just the right mix of warmth and mature understanding. "I'm so glad you decided to come." And Jessica, her pause was perfectly timed, suggesting both forgiveness and subtle superiority. "What a lovely surprise. I wasn't sure you'd received your invitation." The crowd around Madison had gone subtly quiet, sensing the undercurrents of drama that made good party conversation. Jessica felt the weight of their attention. "Madison," Jessica said, her voice warm but controlled, "thank you for including me. The garden looks absolutely stunning. You always did have impeccable taste in staging." It was a compliment with just enough edge to suggest deeper meaning, and Jessica saw Madison's eyes flicker with uncertainty. "You two know each other?" asked Rachel Martinez, appearing at Madison's elbow. "Jessica and I are old friends," Madison said smoothly. "We worked together years ago, before our careers took us in different directions." "Different directions," Jessica repeated thoughtfully. "That's one way to describe it." William watched the exchange with growing admiration for Jessica's subtle skill. She wasn't attacking Madison directly, but she was establishing that there were multiple versions of their shared history. "William, darling," Madison continued, turning to him with affectionate familiarity, "you look wonderful. I hope you've been taking care of yourself." "Never better, actually," William replied, his arm tightening around Jessica's waist. "Jessica's been helping me gain some perspective on a lot of things." Madison's smile remained perfect, but Jessica caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "How wonderful that you found each other," Madison said graciously. "I always think the best relationships grow out of shared understanding. Shared experiences can be very bonding," Jessica agreed, "especially when you've both dealt with similar ... challenges." More guests gathered around them, drawn by the barely concealed tension between beautiful, successful people. "Ladies and gentlemen," Madison announced to the growing crowd, "I want you all to meet some very special people. William Moire, my former partner in life and continuing friend in spirit, and Jessica Reynolds, one of Connecticut's most talented PR executives." It was masterfully done positioning Madison as magnanimous, while subtly emphasizing that both William and Jessica were defined by their relationships to her. Actually, said a familiar voice from behind them. I think most of us know Jessica's work quite well. Jessica turned to see David Chen approaching with champagne, his smile genuine and oblivious to the conversational minefield. David, Madison said, her voice carrying a warning that everyone except David seemed to catch. Jessica Reynolds, David, continued offering her champagne. Your reputation precedes you. I've been following your work on the Meridian campaigns. Brilliant stuff, especially the Henderson Industries crisis. Jessica accepted the champagne with her first genuinely warm smile since arriving. I actually tried to contact Meridian about representing our medical practice. David continued, apparently unaware he was undermining Madison's narrative. But I was told you were too busy with major corporate accounts. The comment landed like a small bomb. Here was Madison's new boyfriend publicly acknowledging Jessica's success, completely contradicting any implication that her career had suffered. Madison's smile finally showed strain. David, I'm sure everyone would love to hear about your work. At the hospital, always interesting cases, he said agreeably, but honestly. I'm more fascinated by the strategic thinking behind modern PR campaigns. The psychology of narrative control is remarkable. Jessica nearly choked on her champagne. David had just introduced the central theme of the evening, narrative control. Narrative control, William repeated thoughtfully. I suppose we all tell ourselves stories about our lives, our relationships, our choices. The question is, Jessica added, her eyes meeting Madison's, whether those stories are honest reflections of reality or carefully edited versions designed to serve our own interests. The gauntlet had been thrown. Madison's party was supposed to be her triumphant narrative about moving beyond a relationship that had held her back. Instead, she found herself facing two people determined to suggest that every story had multiple sides. Well, Madison said, her voice bright but her eyes sharp, I suppose that's what tonight is all about. New beginnings, fresh perspectives, and the freedom to finally tell our own truths. Michael Torres appeared at the edge of their circle, his camera discreetly documenting what would undoubtedly become one of the evening's most talked-about encounters. The battle lines were drawn. The question now was who would control the narrative that emerged from the wreckage. William watched Jessica handle the professional attention with graceful confidence, noting how different she seemed when she wasn't performing for Madison's benefit. This was Jessica in her element, sharp, knowledgeable, and genuinely respected by her peers. It was a stark contrast to Madison's version of events about Jessica's supposed professional decline. I had no idea you two were seeing each other, Patricia continued, gesturing between William and Jessica. Though I have to say, you make a striking couple, much more authentic than some of the pairings we see at these events. The comment was innocent enough, but in the context of Madison's party, it landed like a small explosion. People glanced toward Madison, who was deep in conversation with Rachel Martinez near the bar, her gestures becoming more animated as she spoke. We're still figuring things out, Jessica replied diplomatically, but her hand found William's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Sometimes the most meaningful connections develop when you least expect them. Across the garden, Madison's conversation with Rachel had grown more intense. Even from a distance, William could see the way Madison's perfect composure was beginning to fray at the edges. Her smile had become brittle, and she kept glancing in their direction with barely concealed frustration. I think our hostess is getting ready for her big moment, Jessica murmured to William as the crowd around them dispersed to refill drinks and sample the catered appetizers. She was right. Madison had moved to the center of the garden, near the string quartet, and was gently tapping her champagne glass with a silver spoon to get everyone's attention. The conversations gradually died away as guests turned expectantly toward their hostess. Friends, Madison began, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this new chapter in my life. As many of you know, the past few months have been a time of tremendous growth and self-discovery for me. William felt his stomach tighten. This was at Madison's moment to control the narrative, to present her carefully crafted version of their relationship's end to their entire social circle. Ending a long relationship is never easy, Madison continued, her eyes finding William's across the crowd, especially when you realize that despite all the love and history you share, You've grown into people who want fundamentally different things from life. It was masterfully done. Acknowledging it's the difficulty while positioning their breakup as a mutual recognition of incompatibility rather than any failure on her part. I've learned so much about myself these past few months, Madison went on, her voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom about the difference between love and compatibility, between caring for someone and being able to build a future with them. Jessica squeezed William's hand, sensing his tension as Madison continued her performance. Some relationships teach us about passion, Madison said, her gaze moving meaningfully between William and Jessica. Others teach us about the importance of shared values, of emotional availability, of being with someone who sees you as more than just an accessory to their ambitions. The crowd was hanging on every word, sensing the undercurrents of drama while pretending to be moved by Madison's eloquent self-reflection. Several people glanced between Madison and William, clearly understanding that they were witnessing a very public, very elegant character assassination. But tonight isn't about the past, Madison concluded, raising her champagne glass. Tonight is about celebrating growth, about having the courage to choose authenticity over comfort, and about surrounding ourselves with people who love us for who we really are, not who they want us to be. The toast was met with enthusiastic applause and murmurs of appreciation for Madison's grace and maturity. But Jessica had heard enough. "How beautifully put," Jessica said, her voice carrying clearly as the applause died down. "I particularly appreciate the emphasis on authenticity. It's such an important quality in relationships, don't you think? The willingness to be honest about our motivations, our actions, our true feelings about the people in our lives." The garden went quiet. Again, sensing that Jessica's response was more than just polite agreement with Madison's toast. "Absolutely," Madison replied, her smile still perfect, but her eyes now wary. "Honesty is the foundation of all meaningful relationships." "Really is," Jessica agreed, taking a step forward so that she was addressing the crowd as much as Madison. "I was just thinking about that the other day when someone asked me about the importance of loyalty in friendships, about what it means to truly support the people we care about, especially when they're facing professional challenges." William recognized the shift in Jessica's tone and felt both admiration and alarm. She was about to reveal something, and from Madison's increasingly pale complexion, it was something Madison had hoped would never come to light. "Professional support is so crucial," Jessica continued, her voice warm but her words carefully chosen. "Especially in competitive industries where one person's success can come at another's expense. I've always believed that true friends celebrate each other's victories rather than viewing them as threats to their own advancement." Jessica, Madison said, her voice carrying a note of warning. "I'm not sure this is the appropriate venue for—" "Oh, but Madison, you're the one who mentioned authenticity," Jessica interrupted smoothly. "And I think our friends here would be interested in authentic stories about loyalty and friendship. For instance, the authentic story of how you showed such concern for my professional welfare 2 years ago, when you felt I was in over my head with the Hartwell Industries account." A murmur went through the crowd. Richard Hartwell himself was present, standing near the bar with his wife, and both of them were now paying very close attention to the conversation. "That was a complicated situation," Madison said, her composure finally beginning to crack. "I was trying to protect everyone's interests by going directly to my client and telling them I was too inexperienced to handle their account." Jessica's voice remained conversational, but her words cut like glass. "By suggesting that your father's connections made you a safer choice, by presenting yourself as the more sophisticated option while I was actually in the hospital dealing with my mother's emergency surgery." The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several people gasped audibly, and William saw Richard Hartwell's expression darken as he began to understand what had really happened during that account transition. "You were in the hospital?" David Chen's voice cut through the tension, his confusion and concern evident. "Madison, you never mentioned?" "That's because she didn't know," Jessica said quietly. "I hadn't told anyone except my assistant because I was trying to handle both my mother's crisis and the Hartwell presentation simultaneously." Madison found out about the hospital visits from my assistant, who mentioned it when Madison called, asking about my availability for a lunch meeting. The silence that followed was deafening. Madison stood frozen in the center of her own party, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling around her as their entire social circle processed this new information. Jessica, I think you're misremembering, Madison began desperately. I have emails, Jessica said simply, including the one you sent to Richard Hartwell's assistant the day after learning about my mother's hospitalization, expressing concern about my ability to focus on his account during such a difficult personal time. Richard Hartwell stepped forward, his face grim. Ms. Collins, is this true? Madison looked around the garden desperately, seeking support that was no longer there. Rachel Martinez had backed away from her, looking horrified. David Chen was staring at his girlfriend as if seeing her for the first time. Even the photographer, Michael Torres, had lowered his camera, apparently unwilling to document Madison's public humiliation. Richard, you have to understand, Madison said, her voice breaking slightly. I was trying to protect your company's interests. Jessica was going through a personal crisis, and you thought you'd exploit her family emergency to steal her client, Patricia Whitfield said bluntly. Dear God, Madison, I knew you were competitive, but the party that was supposed to celebrate Madison's triumph had become the stage for her downfall. And they were only halfway through the evening. William felt no satisfaction in watching Madison's public humiliation, only a growing sense that they had unleashed something that none of them could control. Jessica's revelation had been devastating, but he could see in Madison's desperate expression that she wasn't finished fighting. And desperate people, he realized, were capable of anything. The silence in the garden stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Madison stood in the center of her ruined party, her white dress suddenly seeming less like elegant sophistication and more like a surrender flag. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of humiliation creeping up her neck, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her champagne glass. William watched her with a mixture of pity and dread. He knew Madison well enough to recognize the look in her eyes, the same expression she'd worn during their relationship, when she felt cornered or criticized. It was the moment when her composure would crack completely, revealing the volatile emotions she kept hidden beneath her polished exterior. You know what? Madison said suddenly, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence with razor-sharp clarity. If we're talking about authenticity, about being honest with our friends, then let's really be honest. Jessica tensed beside William, sensing the shift in Madison's energy. This was no longer defensive panic. This was someone preparing to go nuclear. Let's talk about emotional availability, Madison continued, her gaze locking onto William with laser focus. Let's talk about someone who is so obsessed with appearances, so desperate to project success, that he couldn't even be present in his own relationship. The crowd, which had been drifting away from the confrontation, found themselves drawn back like spectators at a car accident. Madison's voice carried across the garden with the kind of magnetic horror that makes it impossible to look away. Do you want to know why I really ended things with William? Madison asked, addressing the crowd but never taking her eyes off him. It wasn't about growing apart or wanting different things. It was because after 3 years together I realized I was dating a performance, not a person. William felt the familiar tightness in his chest that he'd experienced during their final argument. The sense of being exposed and found wanting in front of people whose opinions mattered to him. Madison? Don't, he started. But she was beyond stopping now. He planned our entire relationship like a marketing campaign, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she found her rhythm. Every date was chosen for its Instagram potential. Every gift was calculated to project the right image. Every conversation was filtered through his obsession with how we appeared to other people. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing uncomfortable truths about their own social media-driven lives and Madison's accusations. And the proposal, Madison said, her smile turning cruel. Oh, yes, there was going to be a proposal. Do you want to know how romantic it was? He had spreadsheets. Actual spreadsheets comparing engagement ring options based on their social media impact and resale value. The revelation hit like a physical blow. William felt the blood drain from his face as murmurs rippled through the crowd. He had, in Fact, created comparison charts for the ring purchase. But they'd been about budget management and practical considerations, not social media strategy. But explaining that now would only make him sound more calculating, not less. That's not William began, but Madison wasn't finished. And when I finally got up the courage to tell him I couldn't marry someone who saw me as a prop in his perfect life, do you know what he said? Madison's voice cracked slightly, revealing genuine pain beneath the performance. He asked if we could workshop my concerns. Like our relationship was a client presentation that needed better messaging. The words hung in the air like an accusation, and William felt the crushing weight of recognition. He had said something like that in a moment of panic when Madison was ending their relationship. It had been a desperate attempt to problem solve, his way out of losing her, but hearing it repeated now, in front of their friends, made him understand how deeply he'd wounded her. Jessica stepped closer to William, her hand finding his arm in a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by the crowd or by Madison. And now here he is, Madison continued, her voice rising with renewed fury, with my former best friend, playing out the same performance, with someone who should know better. Someone who's seen what he's capable of when he wants something. Madison, that's enough, David Chen said firmly, stepping forward with the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with medical emergencies. You're hurt and embarrassed, but destroying other people won't fix that. Madison whirled on him, her composure finally shattering completely. Don't you dare lecture me about destruction, David. You want to know about destruction? Asked Jessica. What she did to my reputation when she lost the Henderson Industries account because she was, too busy networking with my father's business partners to actually do her job. The lie was so blatant, so clearly desperate, that several people actually gasped. Richard Hartwell stepped forward, his face dark with anger. That's completely false, he said sharply. Jessica Reynolds saved the Henderson Industries account. When their previous PR firm nearly destroyed their reputation with that environmental scandal, I know because I recommended her for the job personally. But Madison was beyond caring about facts now. She was in full scorched earth mode, and William realized with growing horror that she was about to reveal something that would change everything. You want to know the real truth? Madison said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried across the entire garden. The reason I couldn't marry William, the reason I ended our perfect Instagram-worthy relationship, she paused, looking directly at Jessica before turning back to the crowd with a smile that was pure malice. It's because he cheated on me, she announced, her voice ringing with false triumph. With Rebecca Morrison from his marketing firm. Multiple times, over several months, I found the hotel receipts, the text messages, everything. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips, and every eye in the garden turned to William with a mixture of shock and condemnation. That's a lie, William said immediately, his voice hoarse with shock and anger. Madison, that's a complete fabrication, and you know it. Really? Madison pulled out her phone with theatrical flourish. Because I have screenshots of your credit card statements showing charges at the Marriott downtown on days when you told me you were working late. I have text messages between you and Rebecca discussing meeting times. William felt the world tilting around him. The hotel charges were real. He'd used the Marriott's business center and restaurant for client meetings when his office was being renovated. The text messages with Rebecca were about project deadlines and client presentations, but he could see in the faces around him that explanations wouldn't matter now. The damage was done. Madison, Jessica said quietly, her voice cutting through the chaos with unexpected calm. You need to stop. Now. Or what? Madison turned on her former friend with vicious satisfaction. You'll expose more of my secrets? Go ahead, Jessica. We both know you're not as innocent as you pretend to be. No, Jessica said, her voice gaining strength. I'll tell them the real reason you broke up with William. Madison's face went white. Jessica, don't you dare. You were pregnant, Jessica said simply, and the words fell into the garden like stones into still water. You were pregnant, and you had an abortion without telling him. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the string quartet seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and let their music fade away completely. Madison stood frozen, her phone still clutched in her trembling hand. Her face cycling through denial, rage, and finally devastating vulnerability. "How could you possibly know that?" She whispered. "Because you called me," Jessica said gently. "The night after the procedure, you were scared and alone, and you needed someone to talk to. You told me everything about the pregnancy, about the abortion, about how you couldn't bring a child into a relationship where you felt like an accessory instead of a partner." David Chen staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck. "Madison? Is this true?" Madison looked around the garden at the faces of their friends. Shock, pity, judgment, an uncomfortable recognition that they'd witnessed something far too private for public consumption. Her perfect party had become a public execution of her own design. She began, then stopped, her voice failing her completely. Without another word, she turned and fled toward the house, her white dress flowing behind her like a ghost dissolving into the gathering darkness. The party was over, even though half the evening remained. Guests began drifting toward the valet station, murmuring among themselves about what they'd witnessed, already composing the stories they'd tell about the night Madison Collins's celebration became her downfall. William stood in the wreckage of the evening, feeling hollow and shaken. They'd all gotten what they came, for Madison's narrative had been destroyed. The truth had been revealed, and everyone had seen behind the perfect facades they all maintained. But looking around at the scattered champagne glasses and abandoned conversations, William wondered if any of them had considered the cost of that truth, and whether any of them would be able to live with themselves in the morning. The drive back to Hartford passed in heavy silence. Jessica sat in the passenger seat, her elegant black dress now feeling like costume armor she couldn't wait to remove, staring out at the Connecticut countryside as it blurred past in the darkness. William gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his mind replaying the evening's events on an endless, torturous loop. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the Collins estate, where the remaining guests had scattered like debris after a storm. The valet had retrieved William's car with professional efficiency that couldn't quite mask his obvious relief to be helping people escape the wreckage of the evening. Even the service staff had seemed eager to put distance between themselves and the family drama they'd witnessed. "We should talk," Jessica finally said as they reached the outskirts of Hartford, her voice barely audible over the BMW's purring engine. "I know." William's response was equally quiet, weighted with exhaustion and something that felt uncomfortably like regret. Instead of taking the exit toward Jessica's penthouse, William continued toward his own apartment building. Them questioned the decision. They both understood that this conversation needed to happen somewhere private, away from any possibility of interruption or public scrutiny. The elevator ride to the 45th floor stretched endlessly, their reflection in the mirrored walls showing to people who looked like they'd survived a natural disaster. Jessica's perfect makeup had held up admirably, but there was something fragile in her posture that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. William had loosened his tie at some point, and his hair showed the effects of running his hands through it during the drive. William's apartment felt different somehow, sterile in a way that hadn't bothered him before but now seemed almost oppressive. The carefully curated perfection of his living space felt like another performance, another version of the obsession with image that Madison had accused him of earlier. "Can I get you something?" he asked, moving toward the kitchen with the automatic courtesy that years of networking events had ingrained in him. "Wine? Coffee? Something stronger?" "Something stronger," Jessica said without hesitation. "Much stronger." William poured 2 glasses of the Macallan 18 he kept for special occasions, though he wasn't sure what tonight qualified as. A victory? A disaster? Something more complex than either label could capture. They settled on his leather couch, the same couch where he'd read Madison's invitation what felt like years ago, but had been less than 3 weeks. The silence stretched between them again, filled with everything they needed to say but didn't know how to begin. "That was," Jessica started, then stopped, apparently unable to find words adequate to the evening's destruction. "Brutal," William finished. "That was absolutely brutal." "I didn't know," Jessica said suddenly, turning to face him directly. "About the pregnancy? I mean, I knew she'd called me that night, but I didn't know she'd never told you. I assumed." You'd known, and that it was part of why you broke up. William stared into his whiskey, watching the amber liquid catch the light from his floor-to-ceiling windows. She never said a word. Not one word about being pregnant, about the abortion, about any of it. I knew something was wrong in those. The last few weeks. But when I tried to talk to her about it, she just said she was stressed about work. The revelation sat between them like a physical presence. William tried to imagine how different things might have been if Madison had trusted him enough to share what she was going through. If they'd been able to have an honest conversation about their fears and their future, instead of the careful dance of avoidance they'd perfected? Do you think? Jessica hesitated. Do you think she was right about you being emotionally unavailable? It was the question William had been avoiding since Madison's public accusations. But hearing it from Jessica, as someone who'd seen him at his most vulnerable over the past few weeks, forced him to confront it honestly. Yes, he said finally. Not completely, but yes. I was so focused on building the perfect life, the perfect relationship, the perfect image, that I forgot to actually live in the moments I was creating. Madison needed a partner, and I gave her a lifestyle consultant. Jessica nodded. Slowly, I think that's the most honest thing anyone said all evening, including the part about workshopping her concerns. William's laugh was bitter, because that actually happened when she was trying to break up with me. My first instinct was to treat it like a client problem that needed a strategic solution. Oh, William? Jessica's voice carried a mixture of sympathy and understanding that somehow made the admission hurt less. We all have our defense mechanisms. Yours just happens to involve spreadsheets and strategic planning. What's yours? Righteous anger and perfectly timed revelations, apparently. Jessica took a sip of her whiskey, wincing slightly at its strength. God, what did we do tonight? What did we actually accomplish? It was the question that had been haunting William since Madison fled the party. We destroyed someone. He said quietly, went to that party, planning to defend ourselves, to set the record straight, and we ended up destroying Madison completely. She destroyed herself, Jessica said, but there was no conviction in her voice. We just provided the ammunition. Did we, though? Or did we go there looking for a fight and escalate things until she felt like she had no choice but to go nuclear? The question hung between them, unanswerable and uncomfortable. William thought about Madison alone in that enormous house, probably crying in the same bedroom where she'd ended their relationship 3 months ago. Thought about David Chen, driving home to his quiet apartment and trying to reconcile the woman he'd been dating with the person he'd witnessed tonight. He thought about all their friends, processing what they'd seen and wondering how much of their own lives were built on similar foundations of careful image management and hidden truths. I feel sick, Jessica said suddenly. Not from the alcohol. From what we did, from what I did, you told the truth. I weaponized a deeply personal trauma to win an argument at a party. That's not truth-telling, William. That's cruelty. William set down his whiskey and turned to face Jessica fully. In the soft lighting of his apartment, she looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than the polished professional who'd walked into Madison's party with such confidence. We both made choices tonight, he said carefully. Madison made choices too. Maybe the real question isn't whether what we did was right or wrong, but what we do now. What do you mean? We can't undo tonight. Madison's party is already becoming a story that people will tell for years. The truth about her stealing your client is out there, along with the truth about her pregnancy and my emotional unavailability and all the other messy realities we usually keep hidden. The question is, what kind of people do we want to be in? Response to that? Jessica leaned back against the couch cushions, closing her eyes. I don't know. For 2 years, I've been planning what I'd say to Madison if I ever got the chance. I had this fantasy about exposing her lies and watching everyone finally see who she really was. But now that it's happened, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like I became someone I don't recognize, someone who uses other people's pain as a weapon. William reached for Jessica's hand, finding it cold despite the apartment's warmth. Then maybe that's what we learned tonight. Maybe the real cost of revenge isn't what it does to the other person, it's what it does to us. They sat in silence. As Hartford's lights sparkled beyond the windows, two people who'd gotten exactly what they thought they wanted and discovered it tasted like ash Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythms of ambition and desire, people pursuing their own versions of success and happiness. Most of them probably unaware of how easily those pursuits could transform into something ugly and destructive. "I should go," Jessica said eventually, though she made no move to leave. "You should," William agreed, but his hand tightened around hers. They both understood that leaving now would mean more than just ending the evening. It would mean acknowledging that their alliance had been built on revenge rather than genuine connection. That whatever they'd discovered about each other over the past few weeks had been tainted by their shared desire to hurt Madison. But neither of them was ready to face that reality just yet, or William said quietly, "You could stay, and we could figure out who we are when we're not performing for anyone's benefit, including each other's." Jessica opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since they'd met. What she saw was a man who'd spent the evening confronting his own flaws and failures, who'd been forced to acknowledge that his carefully constructed life had been built on the same foundation of image management that had just destroyed Madison. It wasn't the polished marketing executive she'd first approached for revenge. It was someone more complicated, more human, and infinitely more interesting. "Okay," she said simply. "Yeah, let's figure that out." 3 weeks had passed since Madison's party, and the ripple effects continued to spread through Connecticut's social and professional circles like concentric waves from a stone dropped in still water. William sat in Dr. Sarah Klein's office for his regular Thursday appointment, the late morning light filtering through her blinds in parallel lines across her oak desk. "How are you sleeping?" Dr. Klein asked, her pen poised over her notepad in the familiar gesture that had punctuated their sessions for the past 2 years. "Better, actually." William's answer surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise his therapist. Expected to feel worse after everything that happened. The guilt, the regret. But there's something else there, too. What kind of something else? William considered the question, searching for words to describe the strange sense of relief that had settled over him in recent days. "It's like, I've been holding my breath for years and I finally exhaled. Everything about that night was ugly and painful, but it was also real. Maybe the realest I've ever been in front of other people." Dr. Klein nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me about Jessica. How has your relationship with her evolved since the party?" It was a question William had been grappling with daily. In the weeks following Madison's celebration, he and Jessica had spent countless hours together, sometimes talking through what had happened, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence, sometimes exploring Hartford's coffee shops and restaurants, like tourists in their own city. "We're different now," he said finally. "The alliance we built was based on mutual anger and a desire for vindication. But what we have now, it's based on mutual recognition of our flaws and a desire to be better people." That's significant. Growth. It doesn't feel like growth. It feels like demolition, followed by very slow reconstruction. William shifted in his chair, still uncomfortable with the vulnerability that therapy required, but no longer actively fighting it. "I keep thinking about what Madison said at the party, about me being emotionally unavailable, about treating our relationship like a marketing campaign. She wasn't wrong. Recognizing that pattern is the first step toward changing it." Is it, though? Or is recognition just another form of performance? Another way to appear self-aware without actually doing the work of changing? Klein smiled slightly. "The fact that you're questioning your own motives suggests genuine self-reflection rather than performance. What does doing the work look like to you?" William thought about the question, remembering a conversation he'd had with Jessica just 2 nights ago. They'd been walking along the Connecticut River, and she'd asked him what he wanted his life to look like in 5 years. For the first time since college, his answer hadn't involved a promotion, a salary increase, or a status symbol. "It looks like being present," he said. "Actually present. Not just physically occupying space while my mind calculates how every moment contributes to my image or my goals. It looks like having conversations where I'm not constantly monitoring how I'm being perceived." And how does that feel when you practice it? Terrifying, but also liberating. Across town, Jessica was having her own reckoning. Sat in Catherine Brooks' corner office at Meridian Communications. ostensibly discussing the Morrison pharmaceutical account, but actually processing the professional and personal fallout from Madison's party. The Henderson Industries people want to expand their contract, Catherine said, reviewing the file spread across her desk. They were impressed with how you handled the environmental crisis, and apparently Richard Hartwell has been singing your praises since that evening in Greenwich. Jessica nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Catherine, can I ask you something? Of course. When you warned me against going to Madison's party, did you know I'd end up weaponizing her trauma? I did. Catherine set down her papers and studied Jessica with the kind of direct gaze that had made her legendary in PR crisis management. I knew you were angry. I knew you had every right to be angry. But I also knew that anger can make us do things that feel justified in the moment but haunt us afterward. So why didn't you stop me? Because sometimes we have to learn lessons through experience rather than advice, and because despite how ugly that evening became, some truth did emerge. Madison Collins had been controlling narratives and manipulating situations for years. Someone was going to call her out eventually. But did it have to be so brutal? Catherine leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Tell me about William. Are things between you two? The question caught Jessica off guard, though she realized it shouldn't have. Catherine had always been perceptive about the personal motivations behind professional decisions. Complicated, Jessica admitted. We started as allies seeking revenge, but we're becoming something else. Something more honest than either of us has been in a relationship before. That sounds promising. It's also terrifying. I've spent so much energy over the past 2 years being angry at Madison that I'm not sure who I am without that anger. And William is doing this work on himself, questioning everything about how he approaches relationships and success. We're both essentially rebuilding our personalities from scratch. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Jessica considered the question. No, but it means we don't really know who we're becoming or whether the people we're becoming will still want to be together? What does your instinct tell you? That I've never felt more myself with another person than I do with William? But also that the version of myself I am with him is someone I'm still getting to know. That evening, William and Jessica met for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Hartford's Little Italy district. The kind of unpretentious neighborhood place that neither of them would have considered 3 weeks ago, when their dining choices were driven by which establishments would provide the best networking opportunities or social media moments. I saw Dr. Klein today, William said as they shared a bottle of Chianti that cost less than half what they'd typically spend on wine. She asked me about you. What did you tell her? That you're helping me figure out who I am when I'm not performing for an audience. William reached across the table for Jessica's hand, a gesture that had become natural over the past few weeks. What did you tell Catherine? Something similar? That we're both rebuilding ourselves and hoping we still like each other when the construction is finished. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, watching the restaurant's other patrons' families, celebrating birthdays, couples on first dates, groups of friends catching up over red sauce and bread. It was the kind of authentic human connection that had surrounded them for years, but that they'd been too focused on their own performances to notice. I've been thinking about Madison, Jessica said eventually. So have I. Do you think we should reach out to her? I don't know. Part of me wants to apologize for how that evening ended. But another part of me thinks an apology might just be another form of performance, a way to make ourselves feel better about what we did. William nodded. Trevor thinks we should leave her alone. He says some damage can't be undone, and trying to fix it might just make things worse. Trevor's probably right. But it's hard to live with the knowledge that we destroyed someone, even if she was hurting us first. Maybe that's the point, William said quietly. Maybe we're supposed to live with that discomfort. Maybe it's what keeps us from doing something like that again. They finished their dinner and walked through Hartford's evening streets, past the art galleries and coffee shops and independent bookstores that had been there all along, but that they'd never taken time to notice. The city felt different now, less like a stage for their ambitions and more like a place where real people lived real lives. I have a confession, Jessica said as they approached her apartment building. I deleted my LinkedIn account yesterday. William stopped walking. You what? I realized I was spending more time curating my professional image than actually doing professional work. So I deleted it. All of it. The carefully crafted bio, the strategic connections, the posts designed to showcase my expertise, gone. That's terrifying and brave and probably insane. Want to know the strangest part? I feel more like myself than I have in years. They stood outside her building, neither quite ready to end the evening, but both understanding that something significant was shifting between them. The alliance born of revenge was transforming into something deeper and more genuine, a partnership, based on mutual growth rather than mutual destruction. "I love you," William said suddenly, the words emerging without calculation or strategic consideration. "It's not the performance version of you, not the successful PR executive version, not the woman who helped me get revenge on my ex-girlfriend. I love the person who deletes her LinkedIn account because it feels more authentic than maintaining a professional facade." Jessica looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the polished marketing executive who'd approached her weeks ago, but someone who was learning to be vulnerable, to be present, to be human. "I love you too," she said simply. "Even though we're both still figuring out who we are." As they stood there in the warm summer evening, surrounded by the quiet hum of a city going about its business, both of them understood that they were at the beginning of something new. Not just a relationship, but a way of being in the world that prioritized authenticity over image, connection over performance, growth over revenge. It wasn't the ending either of them had imagined when they'd walked into Madison's party 3 weeks ago, but it was perhaps a better beginning than either of them had dared to hope for. 6 months later, William stood in line at a small coffee shop in Boston's Back Bay, his hair unstyled and his clothes chosen for comfort rather than impression. He was reading an actual paperback book instead of checking his phone, when a familiar voice made him look up. "William?" Madison stood 3 people ahead of him, her appearance transformed. Gone was the polished perfection. Her blonde hair was shorter, natural, and she wore simple jeans and a sweater that looked chosen for warmth rather than effect. Madison. His heart still jumped, but not with the old longing, with something closer to concern. They stepped out of line together, finding a quiet corner near the window. "You look..." She paused, studying his face. "Happy? Different, but happy. So do you, actually. How are you better?" "Therapy, mostly. Figuring out who I am when I'm not performing for anyone." She smiled, and it was genuine in a way he'd rarely seen. "I heard about you and Jessica. I'm glad." William felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't realized was still tight. "Madison, about that night, don't." She shook her head gently. "We all said things that needed saying, even if the way we said them was... It's brutal. I've been meaning to write you both letters, actually, to apologize." "You don't need to." "I do. What I did to Jessica was inexcusable."
"Oh."
"And what I said about you that night? Some of it was true, but I used it as a weapon instead of trying to help us both grow." They talked for 20 minutes. 2 people who'd once shared a life, now sharing something more valuable, honest recognition of their mutual failures and genuine hope for each other's futures. When William left the coffee shop, he called Jessica. Immediately. "We'll never guess who I just ran into," he began, but her laughter interrupted him. "Let me guess, Madison, because I got a letter from her yesterday. A real letter. Handwritten, taking responsibility for everything, and wishing us well." That evening, as they cooked dinner together in the apartment they now shared, his space that was lived in rather than curated, Jessica showed him the letter. It was 3 pages of careful handwriting, acknowledging her manipulations, expressing genuine remorse, and ending with a simple wish. "I hope you both find the happiness that comes from being truly known by someone who loves you anyway. Think." "She means it?" William asked, reading over Jessica's shoulder. "I think she's figuring out how to mean it, like we all are." They'd both changed careers in the months since the party. William had left marketing to teach business ethics at a local college, finding satisfaction in helping students think critically about success and authenticity. Jessica had started her own small PR firm, taking on clients whose values aligned with her own rather than chasing prestige accounts. Their relationship was messier than either of their previous ones, filled with honest conversations about fears and failures, Arguments that didn't end with someone performing forgiveness, in moments of genuine intimacy that weren't performed for anyone's benefit. Any regrets? Jessica asked as they cleaned up after dinner, a question that had become a gentle ritual between them. About us? Never, William said, pulling her close. About how we got here? Every day. But I think that's the point. The regret keeps us honest. The regret reminds us who we don't want to be. Outside their windows, Hartford's lights twinkled like grounded stars. And somewhere in Boston, Madison was building a new life based on truth rather than performance. The three of them had learned the hard way that revenge was hollow, that public humiliation solved nothing, and that the stories we tell about ourselves matter less than the reality we create through our daily choices. But they'd also learned that it's possible to start over, to build something authentic from the wreckage of what we thought we wanted. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find someone willing to undertake that construction project with us, not because we're perfect, but because we're committed to becoming real. In the end, that was the only story worth telling. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,